Hello, class. It's now time for our read aloud. We are currently reading A Week in the Woods by Andrew Clements, and we are on chapter 17. Chapter 17 is called Tracks. Let's begin. Mr. Maxwell stopped jogging once he got to the trail. He didn't want to work up a sweat, didn't want his shirt to feel wet. It wasn't that cold yet, only about 50, but he knew the temperature would drop as the trail went up Gray's Mountain toward Barker Falls. Plus, the sun would be going down, and damp clothes in cold weather means trouble for a hiker. Mr. Maxwell settled into a steady pace, counting on his longer stride to quickly eat up the distance between himself and Mark Chelmsley. He did the mental calculations. Soft suburban kid, carrying a pack, walking uphill, can't be making more than 3 miles an hour. At every bend in the trail, Mr. Maxwell expected to see Mark sitting on a log, worn out and footsore, waiting to be rescued. He had no doubts about being on the right trail, even if the boy hadn't been one of the first hikers on the trail this season, and even if his child-sized boots hadn't left distinctive, ridged prints on the softer pieces of ground. Mr. Maxwell would still have been able to follow Mark's trail as easily as a trucker follows the highway. Tracking was one of his specialties. Mr. Maxwell was proud of his woodcraft. He felt he understood nature. He knew the outdoors from both sides. On the theoretical side, he had studied nature as a scientist. He had learned about the plants and creatures of the great northern forest. He had learned about the processes that shaped the landscape. He had learned about the systems of the natural world and how they worked together. On the practical side, he understood the day-to-day rhythms of nature. He had that quiet understanding of the woods and mountains that comes only after years of experience on the ground. Some of Bill Maxwell's friends didn't understand how he could be so concerned about conservation and still be a hunter. That's because they didn't get up with him at 4 in the morning on a crisp fall day and leave the house with nothing but a hunting bow and one razor-tipped arrow. They didn't hike with him for 2 hours in the pre-dawn silence, watching for deer spoor, finding the right place to wait, sometimes for 5 or 6 hours, a place where he could blend with the woods, notice every motion, every change in wind direction, every small sound, waiting for a buck to step into his line of sight. They didn't understand that moment of silently fitting the arrow to the string, slowly drawing it back past his right ear, muscles tensed, aiming at that spot just above the front shoulder of the deer. It wasn't a moment of selfishness. It was a moment of admitting his connection with all of nature, of admitting his dependence on it. It was a moment of gratitude, of reverence for life. And those people who disapproved of hunting didn't understand that for years now, after taking aim, Bill Maxwell would slowly ease the bowstring back to a straight line, make a small noise, and smile as the startled deer bolted into the brush. He didn't take the food nature offered him because he didn't truly need it. He only needed to know that the food was still there. Mr. Maxwell usually did his best thinking as he walked alone in the woods. It usually calmed him down and helped him clear his mind. Not today. Today his thoughts were a tangle of fear and worry, and most of all, guilt. Pig-headed idiot. That's what I am, he said to himself. Got all bent out of shape because some 11-year-old kid wouldn't jump through hoops for me. Had to be the big tough guy and get back at him. Way to go. And the farther Mr. Maxwell walked along the trail, looking down now and then at the small boot prints of the boy, the worse he felt. Mark was alone with his thoughts, too. For a long time he had held on to his anger. He focused only on keeping up his pace. But after more than an hour and a half, Mark realized that someone must be looking for him by now. But of course no one would know where to start. Mark imagined the commotion, people running around, searching all the cabins, calling his name, and Mr. Maxwell would probably be in tons of trouble for getting a kid lost. Lost? That's a good one, thought Mark with a smile. But then he thought, maybe they've called the police, and Leon and Anya, and my parents, because they think I'm lost. And maybe the school will have to cancel the whole program, send all the kids home tomorrow so they can search for me. And that brought Mark to a complete stop at a bend in the trail. The seriousness of what he was doing struck him full force. He was mad at Mr. Maxwell, but he didn't want to ruin the week for everyone else, plus get himself in more and more trouble. Mark sat on the trunk of a big fallen pine tree that lay along one side of the trail. He shrugged off his pack and unzipped the outer pouch. He rustled through his school papers until he found what he wanted. The map Mrs. Farr had handed out in social studies. It was a map of the whole park. It wasn't printed very clearly, but Mark found the Barker Falls Trail. He identified the spur that he'd seen a while back that headed off to the right. It went about a quarter of a mile to a tent platform. And sitting there studying the map, Mark saw a way back. But it wasn't just a way back, it was a way out of the mess he'd started to stir up. The map showed a trail that looped off to the left from the main trail and wound back down to the campground. This loop trail ended up on the far side of the main lodge, away from all the cabins in the council clearing, almost to the parking lots. Perfect, he thought. I take that trail back down, spend the night close to the campground, and then show up in the morning. All I have to do is wander out of the woods over by the parking lot, maybe act like I got lost. And then Mark thought that maybe he should let himself be found tonight. No sense making everyone worry all night. All I have to do is find that trail. It's right here on the map. It has to be close by. Happy with his decision, Mark allowed himself another drink of water and the rest of the energy bar he had nibbled on earlier. As he stood up and turned around to pull on his pack, Mark saw the trail. It was right there, just behind where he'd been sitting. The big pine tree had almost hidden it, but now Mark saw it clear as day, angling off to the left. He stepped up onto the log, jumped down on the far side, and set off along the trail, his heart much lighter and his mind at peace. At 5 o'clock, Mr. Maxwell stopped to catch his breath and evaluate the situation. As he ran down the facts, he counted them off on his fingers. Fact: I've come about 3.5 miles from camp. Fact: no boy in sight. Fact: the trail's getting harder, steeper, and rockier. Fact: Mark has to be close now. He has to be worn out. Fact: it's cloudy, but it won't start to get dark until 7 or so. Fact: if I find Mark in the next hour, we can get back to camp before dark. The last two facts got Mr. Maxwell moving again. Time was running out. It was going to get cold tonight, probably down below freezing. In an hour he'd have to turn back, whether he'd found Mark or not. That would mean the boy would have to spend the night alone on the mountain, and Mr. Maxwell found that thought unacceptable. He fastened the top button of his jacket and set off again, picking up his pace. 10 minutes later, Mr. Maxwell lost Mark's tracks. No boot prints. Doubling back about 200 yards, he found the problem. A big pine tree had been cut down, and the log had been laid along the left side of the main trail. And there were Mark's prints. Mr. Maxwell could see that Mark had sat down and taken off his pack. Then he'd stood up, stepped up onto the log, and gone off onto the other side. He'd taken the side trail. Mr. Maxwell looked at the tracks and then looked at the trail heading off to the left, and he took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Mr. Maxwell knew that trail. He'd hiked it lots of times. It was a loop trail. It looped around back to the campground, but not directly. That trail went across the side of the mountain and then up steeply to a high ridge before it cut back down. The views were beautiful, so beautiful that the trail had been overused. Too many hikers. And then the heavy spring rains had caused some serious erosion, some dangerous erosion. The thick pine log had been laid across the head of the trail for a reason. That trail had been closed for 3 years. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed the read aloud today. Until tomorrow, make a great day.